Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk about the translation of Bloodborne. We're going to start things off right away with an item description, but per viewer request, this time I'll be reading the more literal version aloud with the official English on screen. Gun Spear, trick weapon that is the work of the heretics of the workshop, the gunpowder warehouse. A prototype made by combining a simple gun and a spear, this is also said to have been made in imitation of a lost Cainhurst weapon. Not a weapon that possesses any noteworthy functionality in isolation, but a special item as the only trick weapon that can also be a gun. So, as you can see, this is another fairly straightforward translation, though as always there are a couple of terms I'd like to focus in on. The first is the name of the weapon itself. In the Japanese, it's literally just the word for gun and the word for spear stuck together, much like the item itself. The effect of the English item name is similar, but the name has been broken into two separate words, so there is a slight difference in that regard. There's also a technical consideration to keep in mind here, since the Japanese term is a general one, while the English term is a more specific reference to firearms with grooves carved into the barrel, or rifling, though that specific point is one that I don't find to be worth dwelling on. Really, I suspect that since rifle spear has a more appealing ring to it than gun spear, at least to my ear, that term was the one that was selected, and it also happens to be a term that works better as two separate words rather than just one. The interesting thing to me about this is that I think it shows how even when considering a fairly standard translation choice, there are sometimes interesting features of the original language that don't get carried over. By contrast, though, there are some terms that arguably function even better in a given target language as opposed to the original. Which brings me to the other term I wanted to highlight here, the official name given to the workshop heretics in English, the powder kegs. The original Japanese would literally translate to something like the gunpowder warehouse or the gunpowder store. It refers to a place where gunpowder is kept, though it does have a secondary meaning as a metaphor for places that are likely to break out in conflict. The Japanese equivalent of the phrase, the powder keg of Europe, uses this term. And that fact in and of itself helps make the case for using the English term powder keg, since it mirrors both the literal and the figurative meaning of the Japanese term. But I would argue that the English works even better in the context of this particular game because of the time frame that specific set of words evokes. Merriam-Webster identifies the first known use of powder keg in 1791, and these items seem to have remained in use until the 1870s. Certainly today people don't tend to make reference to powder kegs as storage facilities for gunpowder, instead favoring terms along the lines of munitions depot or ammunition dump, whereas the Japanese term does appear to still be in use. The other nice thing about this time frame is that the Victorian era, which Bloodborne seems to resemble the most, lasted from roughly the 1830s to 1900, overlapping with the usage of this particular term. So powder keg not only fits both senses of the Japanese word, it also has the benefit of being period appropriate. An interesting case where the translated term seems to be better than the original. But now let's focus on this item. Henryk's hunting hat of the old hunter Henryk. Because this quiet old hunter, once a partner of Father Gascoigne's, was a powerful one, he was unable to obtain a place of death as a hunter. However, his distinctive yellowish garb, particularly strong against lightning, may be of some help to a hunter who has inherited the will of beast hunting. Now, here we see what I find to be a perplexing set of translation choices. In the official English, the second set of lines in the item description seems to put the focus squarely on the relationship between Henryk and Gascoigne. It not only notes that the two were once partners, it goes on to describe them as a fierce and gallant duo, and it tells us that this very partnership led to Henryk's tragically long life. By contrast, the original Japanese doesn't seem to place nearly this much emphasis on the partnership. To get somewhat technical about my read of the language here, we have two pieces of information modifying the noun old hunter, which is the subject of the sentence. The first piece of information is that this hunter was once a partner of Father Gascoigne's, and the second piece of information is that this hunter was quiet. Then there's another set of phrases saying that as a result of being a powerful person, the old hunter who was the subject of the sentence was unable to obtain a place of death as a hunter. This puts the emphasis solidly on the individual hunter Henryk and his strength, with what seems to me to be the indication that because he was so skilled, he lived long enough to avoid an honorable death as a hunter, instead going mad and dying in disgrace by the blade of the hunter of hunters. Not only is the focus taken off of the relationship between Henryk and Gascoigne, there's a clear suggestion of just why Henryk's life could be described as tragically long. Something that's always been a point of confusion for me. But the thing that chiefly concerns me here is that I'm not sure why this particular set of translation choices got made. The shift in emphasis away from the individual strength of a hunter and how that can lead to the tragedy of outliving one's humanity, towards a partnership that became the cause of a tragically long life, perhaps as a result of outliving one's partner, seems like a significant one, but I'm not sure what motivates it. Now, it could be that I'm misreading things, or that things got switched around during development for some reason, but ultimately I can't say why this particular version got settled on. Which just leaves one thing for me to point out briefly, namely that in the Japanese, we're seeing another potential reference to blood echoes being referred to as dying will. At the end of the item description, the Japanese here literally indicates that the garb may be of help to a hunter who has inherited the will of beast hunting. So now on to this lore note. Filthy madmen, their rituals summon the moon, and that is being hidden. There is nothing for it but to break the concealment. And where before the official English may perhaps have been more ambiguous than the Japanese, here I think we have a clear example of the opposite, something demonstrated most clearly by the line that literally comes out to, and that is being hidden. It's kind of ambiguous what that might be referring to. The English makes it obvious, though, that what's being hidden is the madmen's work, by rephrasing the whole line to, madmen toil surreptitiously in rituals to beckon the moon. Of course, that's hardly the only thing that's interesting about this particular note. Another thing I think is worth mentioning is the shift to the imperative. My more literal rendering of the final line would be, there is nothing for it but to break the concealment, as opposed to the official, uncover their secrets. Now, I'm sure character limitations have a role to play here, and the imperative form is definitely shorter. But one noteworthy side effect of this particular translation choice is that it addresses the message directly to the player. In the original Japanese, there's the possibility that the note is directed more towards the person who wrote the note, like many of the other ones we find throughout the game. Here's the thing though, technically right now we're in part of a late game area earlier than we should be, and this recontextualizes all of the notes that we find here. As we'll see more clearly later, I think rendering this particular note into the imperative fits better with the rest of the context from that point in the game. What I really like about the Japanese phrasing, though, is that it could in theory be interpreted one way towards the beginning of the game, where many of the notes don't seem to be directed at the player, and then another way later in the game, where the Japanese notes themselves take on the imperative form. And speaking of which, one of the few other notes of this variety that we can find right now just happens to be right here. Look, a sky of blood gone pale. Talk about simple and to the point. But even so, I think there are a couple things worth mentioning about this. First of all, the Japanese itself here is in an imperative form, the tamae form that I've talked briefly about before, which is often used by people of higher rank to give orders to people of lower rank, though here I suspect it's mostly being used to establish tone. Telling someone to look in this particular manner in the Japanese really does lend itself to the English word behold. And the other thing I think it's worth mentioning is the term pale blood. I don't think I've mentioned this before, but the single word pale blood is actually a short phrase in Japanese, aozametachi, which means blood gone pale, or even more literally, blood that has faded in color to blue. Given character limitations and the importance of the term as a unified concept, I think referring to this as pale blood was an inspired decision, but I thought the literal version was worth noting. And with that out of the way, let's take a look at this rune. Beast, one of the secret letters left by copyist Caryll, student of Byrgenwerth. This is a transcription of the roar of the Beast of the Ruins. It was given the meaning of beast and raises the effect of beast transformation for a time. Beast was the first Caryll letter, and also the first forbidden letter. The discovery of blood was, in other words, the discovery of an undesirable beast. So here we see a number of interesting translation choices. First, there's an interesting point of ambiguity in the original Japanese in the line, a transcription of the roar of a labyrinth beast. Note the use of in the phrase, a labyrinth beast. In my more literal translation, I've deliberately gone with a variation, so my line reads, a transcription of the roar of the beast of the ruins. And the reason I did this so deliberately was to demonstrate that this was a valid translation choice, and on a point with some potentially large implications for people interested in putting together the lore of the game. Now it does seem unlikely that there's only one beast in all of the underground labyrinth beneath Yharnam, and the other possibility that the roars of more than one beast were transcribed is also pretty hard to believe, so the official version is almost certainly the appropriate choice here, but I thought it was worth emphasizing once again how slight differences in interpretation and in translation can have large consequences. And speaking of differences, I'm intrigued at the move away from some specific information that the official translation makes in this description. The Japanese is about as clear as can be that this rune, beast, was the first one. The English, though, tells us only that this was one of the early Caryll runes. I'm not entirely sure why that particular bit of information happened to be obscured, though. Perhaps my understanding of the lore of the game is too limited, but I don't see how knowing which Caryll rune came first gives the player too much information. Of course, I suppose the same argument could be made from the other angle, and that since obscuring that particular bit of information wouldn't have much consequence, making it so that the original Caryll rune no longer can be determined only adds to the game's air of mystery, reinforcing how little can truly be known. Still, on a thematic level, I do think the fact that the first rune discovered would be the transcription of the roar of a beast, and that this rune would also be the first to be outlawed is a significant one that loses some of its impact with this change, especially since the final line emphasizes that the discovery of blood and its desirable benefits came together with the discovery of undesirable beasts. That having been said, not every piece of a translation that is potentially thematically relevant is necessarily worth preserving. This brings me to my last point, and it's one that's not confined to the specific rune description either. Often in my literal translation of runes, you'll note the phrase, given the meaning of whatever the rune is. In this case, it would be, given the meaning of beast. Yet, as you may have already realized, that particular phrase never shows up in the official English, and it seems likely to me that this was a specific translation choice, likely to allow for some breathing room with the character limitations. It is somewhat redundant information after all, since we already know in general that Caryll runes are the transcribed sounds that have been given certain meanings for various reasons, and the translations do give us those reasons. On the whole, I'd say it's a trade-off I find worth making to lose that phrase in order to better convey the rest of the information. But part of me does really enjoy seeing the emphasis on the somewhat arbitrary and questionable assigning of meanings to these symbols, as it really helps drive home to me how these transcriptions are attempts to grapple with things outside of human understanding. So with that in mind, let's take a look at one more. Moon, one of the secret letters left by copyist Caryll, student of Byrgenwerth. This is a transcription of the voice of the higher-ranked one that dwells in the nightmare. It was given the meaning of moon and brings about additional dying wills of blood. The higher-ranked one of the nightmare is of a sympathetic spirit, and therefore often responds to the voices of those who call. So remember my point earlier about the potential to translate things as singular rather than plural making a big difference? Well, this is one such instance. Based only off of the original Japanese used here, it would be entirely possible to think first that the rune was based off of the transcription of the voice of a single Great One among many different Great Ones, and second that the thing that distinguishes this particular Great One is that it dwells in the nightmare. Now, in either language, the game is vague about what exactly the nightmare is. We've seen the hunter's dream referred to as both a dream and a nightmare, for instance, and later on in the game we'll come across several different nightmare realms. Which of these realms is the nightmare is uncertain, and of course, like with the number of Great Ones, based only on the original Japanese, there could be multiple nightmares this passage is referencing. The final line, for instance, could easily be rendered, the Great Ones of nightmares are sympathetic in spirit. So are we talking about one Great One in one nightmare, several Great Ones in several nightmares, or several Great Ones in one nightmare? These lines in and of themselves don't really give us any answers, and since the numbers, identities, and locations of the Great Ones are all things with huge implications for the underlying lore of the game, the answer is anything but trivial. Of course, in this case, the answer provided by the official translation is that this is a reference to several Great Ones in one nightmare, but exactly why they made this choice is something I'm curious about. Typically in translation, the rule of thumb is that you treat something as singular except for when you have some evidence that it should in fact be plural. Though Japanese does treat plurals differently than English, there are still many different ways to specify when more than one of a noun is being referred to. Even in cases when it's still unclear whether the singular or plural is being used, it's not uncommon, as part of the translation process, to ask the developer about cases where there could be confusion. The fact that we have multiple Great Ones and a singular nightmare being referred to in translation, then, could very well be part of information given specifically to the translation team that a Japanese player of the game wouldn't necessarily have access to. Or it could be that there's external context to consider here, so it might pay for us to keep an eye out for in-game reasons outside of just this item description for that particular set of translation choices. Alternatively, there's another form of outside context to consider. In the Lovecraftian mythos, there are beings referred to as Great Ones that are said to dwell in and rule over the Dreamlands. So if we think of the Great Ones in the game as analogous to the Great Ones who live in Kadaf, the idea of several Great Ones dwelling in one nightmare makes some sense. Still, that's all information from an entirely separate form of media with no direct internal connections to the game itself, so I'm hesitant to accept this as sufficient explanation. Anyway, setting that issue aside until we have a bit more evidence, that just leaves one related point I've been wanting to make for some time now. I'm sure you've noticed that in my more literal translations, I've been referring to the Great Ones as higher-ranked ones. This is a fairly literal rendering of the kanji used to represent these beings: above, rank, and one, referring to a person. And the idea seems to be similarly straightforward. These are beings of a higher grade than humans. Given that concept, then, I think Great Ones is a very effective way to get that across. And, as we've already discussed to some extent, that particular terminology fits in well with the language used by H.P. Lovecraft, who described the gods of Earth as Great Ones, and beings of great power originally from other worlds like Cthulhu as Great Old Ones. So again, we have an apt translation and a nice reference here, which I would say brings us to a nice place to stop. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for me, please do let me know. Thanks for watching, everyone.